I can announce this government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. Yeah. We will deliver our commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, but we will bring it forward so that we reach that level in 2027.
Mr. Speaker, the world has changed. We must respond. The SDR is our plan for change for defence, a plan to meet the threats we face, a plan to step up on European security and lead in NATO, a plan that learns the lessons from Ukraine, a plan to seize the defence dividend from our record increase in defence investment to boost jobs and growth throughout the United Kingdom, and a plan to put the men and women of our armed forces at the heart of our defence plans. Better pay, better kit, better housing. Through the SDR, we will make our armed forces stronger and the British people safer.
So, Greg, you and I are both veterans of several strategic defence reviews over the years, and the cynic in me was fully expecting this to be just another lovely form of words that reads well but actually does nothing different. Actually, this one does feel a lot different, and not only because it's set in a context where it feels like a once-in-a-generation shift in the threat that we have, a more dangerous world. What was your take?
Yeah, I'm quite like you. I mean, you and I have spent all day steeped in this, and of course, we've been waiting with bated breath for the actual words, as opposed to the ones that made the papers. And we've only literally been able to skim it because it's still a long document. I think it's really crunchy, and I think the most important thing is it's realistic. I think it talks about the threat in the terms that everybody will understand. It says why transformation now is absolutely vital because of the state and the stage that we've got to in defence, and that's an admission that we haven't seen before, and I think that is important. Others will talk about the realism of the money and the doability of this, but I think to start off, the first few chapters came clean, and that for that it deserves some credit.
No, I fully agree. It's quite difficult to not try and solve everything in this, but it is it's 144 pages. There's about 99 of the crunchy stuff. But it actually does, rather than be vague, it does actually provide quite a lot of... Can I pull you back to the sort of headlines? Because you mentioned money. I mean, there's a lot of tap dancing around at the moment. 2.3 to 2.5% sounds like an increase. And maybe a commitment to 3% in the next Parliament. The trouble is, it feels to me that you and I both served in the Cold War where 4% was what we were spending, and it feels like a more dangerous world. And we've had 35 years with gaps appearing. Do you get a sense that, given the aspiration of that defence review, that 2.5% is even going to be close to be able to fund it?
Yeah, I think that is the big question, because there's an awful lot of reform that needs to take place in order for that money to be spent better than it has in the past. And that is not an easy task. The MOD has struggled with those transformations in the past. So that is, and it is front and center in the paper, to be fair, but it is relying on all those coming good. So that will be absolutely key to this, as will, of course, the relationship with industry in order to make this happen. So the authors actually wrote a piece in the Telegraph, I think it was today, where they have said, look, we were asked to set out what we thought we needed to meet the threats, but we were also told, and how do you do that within the headroom? And of course, the headroom changed in the middle of the review. We suddenly saw the 2.5%, whether that was because of Donald Trump or not. And now we've seen this so-called 3% promise. So they've now planned or written a paper that's around those promises. So those promises have to come good in order for this to work. And a lot of that money comes later in the program, and it's not up front. And of course, we all know this, defence inflation, which is a thing, as it turns out, is greater than national inflation. So, yeah, the money will go less far.
I think the reason I wanted to focus a little bit on this, though, was politically, there's always going to be a lot of gloss about, where we're going up from 2.3 to 2.5, bigger sustained investment in defence. But if you unpick it, we've had several briefings, haven't we, over the last few days, and chatting to colleagues, and most people think that 2.5 is actually almost standing still, and it's only when you get to 3% that you can actually genuinely start to turn the dial. And the problem is that number seems to be by the end of the next Parliament, 2034, and we're talking therefore almost a decade's time. It doesn't feel like we've got long enough to wait for that sort of period of time.
Yeah, and with the threat as it stands, and I think that's the balance that the paper's trying to strike here. It's not trying to say war is imminent, but it is saying that the threat is real and it's not far away. So it is a tightrope. It does talk a lot more about national resilience as well as defence, so that this is not just about defence, it is beyond that. So I think when we finally see the security review piece adding to this, I think we might see other investment elsewhere in some of those elements.
No,
but yeah,
I get it, but I think if I was pushing the point just a bit further, it would be that we both know that there's the Hague summit coming up in later in June, and that's where all 32 NATO nations will be getting together. There'll be lots of people trying to placate Trump. I suspect there'll be a lot of theatre around that. But they're talking about a number of 3.5% with gusting 5%, depending on what you include in it. And I just wonder how, on one side, the UK stated it wants to be a leading voice in NATO, but if it's not prepared to go to those sorts of lengths, I don't know how it's going to do that.
You're right. That is going to be a very difficult political balancing act. I mean, it will be interesting to see whether they actually agree these higher figures. And obviously, some nations have already gone beyond them. And it's the nations that are nearest to Russia that understandably are making the most noise. So let's see how that plays out. I think if the UK ends up as an outlier with everyone else saying, no, okay, 3.5% it is, then off we go, then the UK is going to have a problem. It's going to have a rethink, particularly, as you say, if it wants that leadership role in NATO.
It was fascinating as well. If we drift onto NATO, the policy was originally started as a NATO first. What was very clear in the defence review was NATO first, but not NATO only. And I wonder whether, obviously, the defence review was commissioned back in July last year, and it finished, I think, in February this year, just shortly after President Trump came into power. And of course, all of that raised questions about the future of NATO. And I wonder whether that language has been just adapted slightly. But I do think one of the things that's been very clear in the briefings around this is that any future of NATO without American involvement would mean a transformational escalation in the amount of money we would need to spend to start to cover off the capabilities that America provides. Therefore, the tightrope is making sure that America recognizes that Europe has stepped up to the challenge, but also recognizes that we are stronger together. That seems to be a theme coming out from the paper.
Yeah, really strong theme. I think one of the things that I think is right that anybody listening to this podcast, if they really don't, if we haven't covered the detail, and we can't possibly in a single podcast, go and read the document. It's very well laid out. It's the absence of some of the language that we've seen in previous ones. So the tilt to the Pacific is not mentioned so strongly here. Yes, we should focus on the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific after the Euro-Atlantic. And the Euro-Atlantic is thick through this document. And that did not used to be the case in previous years. The most interesting thing is the absence of that discussion about America distancing itself. In fact, it very strongly implies that America will still be a strong part of NATO. It may be less present in Europe. It doesn't really cover that, but I think it accepts that may be the case. But it absolutely is written as if America is as strong there today as it was a few years ago. And and I know that talking to some of our sources, that is the strong belief within defence, and therefore I guess they're the ones on the inside. They hear what's being said. We only hear what's said on TV and said in public. So I guess there's an element of faith there.
Yeah, that's probably fair. I think the other one I was really interested in where defence priorities lay, because inevitably in the past we've been a global force for good, and that's still tucked away in but it's far more about the dangerous world. One thing that I wasn't quite sure about is it talks about we need to get our military ready for war fighting. And I sort of think, well, what were you and I doing for the last 35 years? We were preparing for war fighting. I think what that means, though, is that rather than being a sort of coin operated when we need to go because there's a war of choice and therefore we prepare to go and then go, what we probably need to be more configured is a deterrence force that, in other words, 24/7, 365 days a year, presents an ever-present deterrent, small d, so that any nation like Russia that suddenly fancies its chances looks across the border to NATO and across the UK and goes, do you know the risks far outweigh the benefits? What was your take on that sort of focus on war fighting?
Yeah, I think, and unfortunately, I think some of the media outlets have picked up on that in almost scaremongering that, oh my goodness, that are we going to war tomorrow? And if you remember, Pete Hegseth just the other day at the Shangri-La dialogue talks about imminent invasions of Taiwan. Some of it is meant to shock and almost sort of frighten people into action. But what it means is that in order to be an effective deterrent, you have to be ready to fight. Because if the enemy thinks there's a weakness or they think there's an opportunity, then they might choose to exploit that. If they think there's cracks within NATO, if they think there's a weakness on the front line, they might see an opportunity. So being ready to warfight really means having a plausible and credible deterrence. So I think it's the language of deterrence that probably is more important here. But in order to deter, you've got to be credible. And therefore, you've got to be ready. So, yeah, we're not about to go to war tomorrow, but we might if we don't show strength. And that's the key here.
The other one that caught my eye was remember networked enable capability and all that. This theme's popped up again, but this time in terms of use the word integrated force, that rather than a joint force, we need to be much more integrated. And I was trying to work out, okay, is that just a play on words? But it seems to be much more chunky than that. Each of the three services has pursued their own sort of avenue with regard to embracing technology, the digital era, what databases they use, what software they use, and whatever. And one of the themes that sort of crops up a bit more, which I thought was really interesting, was it felt like they were really making a push for making integration, digital integration, a centerpiece, because then AI, exploitation of the data out there would be something that would be a battle-winning capability. And they talked about the three I's, didn't they? Integration, innovation, and industry. And I didn't see that as a soundbite. I genuinely saw that as we've talked about this for 20 years and we've not done it. There seemed a real sense that we've got to do it now.
Yeah, and I think you see a strong hand there of Richard Barron's, the general who was one of the authors, because he'd been saying this for quite some time, even when he'd been serving. Yeah, digitization in the digital world is writ large through this review, and rightly so. It's the world we live in. It's not just the world we fight in. If anything, defence is now behind the drag curve, and our connected world has almost got ahead of it. I've heard people talk about how you genuinely integrate your targeting networks, and some of the language I've heard is that every sensor can talk to every shooter. And what that means in praxis is that a ship detecting something can pass that data to a soldier, to an airman, to an aircraft, and back again, and then talk to a weapon that's fired by another platform. So in other words, your entire system runs on not necessarily a common platform, but a platform that talks to each other and shares data and shares information. That doesn't just mean having the same computer language. It genuinely means integrating the force to operate effectively as one. And that's very different to just being joint, where we've allowed forces to sort of nestle together at the edges. But this is something that has a common digital backbone that can operate seamlessly.
I think I heard somebody describe it as the Internet of Things, and I was explaining this to somebody the other day, and they looked at me in absolute horror because they thought that the military surely was already operating. And I sort of went, okay, it wasn't that long ago that we had 40 odd different databases of Salisbury Plain, none of which would talk to each other because we'd bought them from different software manufacturers and they all were incentivized to have their own database. And because, so why aren't we all using the same? Well, land operates over fields, so they want a very, very high, rich definition, small scale, map, whereas air forces operate at Mark II, so they want a very different. And you sort of go, yes, but having some sort of a play area, some ecosystem where all of these elements can plug and play, not only in the virtual world, but also in the real world, could deliver massive benefits, particularly if you want to use AI that wants to harvest massive amounts of information. Well, that's what the armed forces should be starting to collect. I'm not quite sure how easy it will be to get to, but I was very warm that this seems to be a motive for this defence review.
It will be tough. And I think the idea that we're going to bring the commercial world in to help us do this is absolutely right and proper. But this is not, the Internet of Things you bring up. This is not your fridge ordering milk just when it starts to run out. We're talking about a system which has to be secure. So in other words, the enemy can't get inside and work out what you're up to. It has to be able to operate in a contested environment of electronic warfare, spectrum, interference, etc., and under fire. So we're talking about a system, and as you rightly say, across all those domains at different speeds, at different tempos. So we are talking about something here that isn't just, an internet for the military. If we can create that and then it works, and that's great. But of course, it isn't quite that straightforward. And you're right; every platform ends up with this proprietary software, and we need to get to the back of that and somehow solve that problem as well. So this is difficult. And in the real world, we have troubles making our Android phone talk to our Apple phone. This is on a completely different scale to that, and that is the challenge for defence.
The other thing that I saw, which again warmed me slightly, you and I have heard of lots of defence industrial strategies over the years. Very few of them actually seem to deliver because we churn our way through procurement incredibly slowly and the like. This time, though, they talked about industry and the defence industrial strategy being an engine for growth. And in a way saying big ships and tanks and aeroplanes might take a while to procure. The vast majority of other equipment has to be done much more swiftly. And if we can invest in our defence industrial base, then surely there'll be export opportunities, and therefore it will limit the cost to ourselves. It felt much more like a real push for a partnership with industry, so that actually not only does it give prosperity and jobs in this country and therefore limit the impact of greater defence spending, but if that defence spending was also subsidised by the fact we've got a defence industrial strategy that exports, very much like America does very successfully, then actually it could be a vote winner and a growth for prosperity initiative. It sounds a big ask, but that seemed to be a cornerstone of this defence review.
Yeah, I would say it's nearly 50% of the whole concept. That without that working, it kind of all falls apart, because then 3% doesn't go far enough. So it is absolutely fundamental. I think there's two. Well, the first thing is we've seen John Healey and Keir Starmer in front of ships and missiles now for weeks. So they get it. That's the reason they're out there in the factories, talking to industry, talking to the workers, and fundamentally underpinning this entire thing on that growth agenda. But also seeing the benefit to defence in terms of how that works also for better value for money within the UK. A lot of that, of course, will require exports. So that's a key part of this as well. So we'll have to see how that plays out. I think the challenge here, and it's always been a challenge for defence, is convincing the Treasury that $1 spent in MOD is more than the sum of its parts when you look at what that then does out in the real economy. And that is the challenge here. So industry's got to step up, but government's also got to find better ways of operating with industry. So the National Armaments Director, the whole new procurement process has all got to embrace this so that everybody wins. Defence gets value for money and gets a product as fast as it possibly can. Industry gets the jobs and therefore does the growth. And government gets the receipts. I mean, what's not to like?
Yeah, but you raise a really good point, because for many years, I remember using the example where if the MOD wanted a submarine and France was prepared to sell one for £70 million and it was going to cost us 100 million to build it, we went and bought it from France. And you sort of went, hang on a minute, there's an economic model that says for every pound you spend in the UK, you recycle a lot of that because people pay taxes, they buy things, it takes them off welfare. And, the number changes, but it was the best part of 50p in every pound recycled. And therefore, for the UK, 100 million spent on a submarine was actually only costing you 50 million. Therefore, it was cheaper than buying from France. But because the MOD didn't get any benefit of that model, it had to find the cheapest. And finding a way of breaking that model apart so that you genuinely start to look at defence as an enterprise that can be a growth engine for the UK, I think needs the Treasury involvement with that.
Yeah, it does. And we've got to be pragmatic. It can't be buy British at any cost either. I mean, if you don't happen to, now submarines is a bad example because we do make submarines, but if we didn't make submarines, building a factory, recruiting all the teams, training them, building up the expertise knowledge would be crazy because it would be so expensive. So it's buying and investing in the things that you do well, and where necessary, buying from elsewhere at the most efficient cost. And if you can bring some of that work on shore, great. You make that part of the contract. But yeah, this isn't buy British. What's the question? It's buy British where it makes sense. And I think that's where the defence industrial strategy also needs to be quite smart here. It needs to get us focused on the things that we do well and that would make us the best return on our investment. So, let's not go chasing every technology out there. Where we can buy that from friends and allies, or even in partnerships, then we absolutely should do that too.
Yeah, we could talk for hours about this, but let's obviously there's a lot of stuff out there. Can we have a now look at sort of what the implications are, rather than for the full armed forces, because obviously there were all sorts of sections, air, land, maritime, there's cyber and everything. But given we're looking at the Air and Space Power Association, the implications for air power in there, one of the things was F-35. I was very intrigued by it. Talked about extra buys. It also talked about the F-35A, and we talked about that before because it goes further, it's cheaper, it's more cost effective as a solution. But there's also a lot of links in the press beforehand around this nuclear question, weren't there? Where do we stand with that?
Yeah, and you have to look for clues in the paperwork, because I think quite rightly there's not been a big discussion about a nuclear deterrent in the paperwork for good reason. I mean, there is a chapter on the nuclear deterrent, and it fundamentally reinstates why it's so important. There's a couple of little hooks that I think the papers have latched onto and have perhaps sort of gone one or two steps too far. There's talk about how we might enhance NATO's nuclear deterrent. Now, we don't know what that means because we didn't write it, but it could mean because of America and how much America is now focused elsewhere with China, etc. So there could be that element. But there's also a recognition that the UK has a very high-end strategic nuclear deterrent. And there is quite a long gap, therefore, between that and the next sort of best capability, which is perhaps some of our longer range conventional capability, which again we don't have much of. So what might fill that gap? So what might that enhanced NATO nuclear deterrent look like? And some have assumed that could therefore be the UK moving into an air capability. So that's the nuclear bit. There's then a section in the air chapter that talks about we need more F-35s. And they might be A's or B's. And that's because you and I know this. The A, if you're just looking at it from an air power perspective, it gives you your most bang for your buck. Goes the furthest, costs the least, is the least cost to operate. And therefore it is your better air power version of the platform. But we know that it doesn't operate off the carriers. So that causes that dynamic. What someone has done in the papers is join those two stories together and come up with three. And I think whilst that could be a potential answer downstream, you could marry up a tactical nuclear weapon with an F-35A. That is not what the document says. But there are hooks in there that could lead you to that conclusion. So I think there's a lot more work to go on there. It sounds to me like there is clearly a classified conversation going on about how NATO now needs to think about nuclear, particularly because of the way Russia is now saber rattling with its own tactical nukes. And the UK needs to think about whether it's got enough combat air, because actually that's the message I took out of the chapter in air, is that if F-35 and Typhoon and then GCAP, and GCAP gets a mention, so clearly that's a tick in the box, is that if that is at the centre of our integrated air missile defence, and at the moment it is, and that's what the paper says, we're going to need more of them. So I think there is an up arrow for combat air. It says it wants to be a leader in NATO in combat air. So there are definite up arrows here for the platforms. There is then a subsequent question about what you might do with those platforms once you've got them.
Yeah, it also talks about that sort of mix of high end and low end, doesn't it? And it comes out several times in the defence review. And I think what it means when it's talking about combat air is the ability to have manned platforms, relatively comprehensive, but also having sort of unmanned wingmen, drones that can also make part of that force mix. Without going through every item, I think there was also there is a reflection that the Air Force is pretty well capitalised at the moment. But even so, it specifically mentioned an uplift in E7s, the airborne early warning aircraft. Any idea what motivated that or the numbers involved?
Yeah, well, I think we've known for a while because the E7 buy was less than we hoped for the first time round. Although, if I remember rightly, we've ordered or ended up paying for another 3 radars. So in theory, it's relatively simple to go and buy a couple of, 3 737s and stick 3 more radars on that we've already got in on the shelf.
Simple.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a recognition that capability gap is one that probably is unbearable. And to be so specific in the document, it does, however, say when affordability allows. So it's not tomorrow. But the fact that is mentioned clearly is a clear statement that's a gap that cannot be sustained.
Another area you mentioned earlier was this integrated air and missile defense system. For the uninitiated, if you look at what Israel suffered a bombardment from Iran of strategic missiles, Russia is launching them regularly against Ukraine, yet we don't have a ballistic missile defensive type system in the UK. It was interesting that it was mentioned, but if you went down into the small print of this, it talked about 1 billion being allocated. Now, £1 billion is a lot of money. So one of the systems that's available on the market, £1 billion, is the Patriot system. But of course, 1 billion buys you one system. That is clearly nowhere near enough to cover the gap. What was your take then? Is this a stepping stone to recognise there's a gap that needs to be filled, or is this genuinely a credible means of trying to do it on a very tight budget?
Yeah, again, this is another area where you have to look for clues and then try and decipher what actually is being promised. There's a little box in the air chapter about integrated air missile defense, but talks very much about how F-35 and Typhoon are a fundamental part of it. It also then goes on to say, by the way, that there's not enough of them to do that. So there's another up arrow. It doesn't talk about an Iron Dome. It doesn't talk about a Golden Dome. And I think we all know that if we tried to put air defences around every vulnerable site in the UK, we'd probably spend the entire 3% of the defence vote. So that's not going to happen. There is another mention of it in the space chapter, which talks about how we could have persistent surveillance from space that acts as part of that warning mechanism. And there's also in the chapter about NATO about how we need to do this as part of an alliance. So I think we're not talking about a sovereign system here. I think we're talking about our position and our part within the broader NATO context and what things that we can bring to bear, perhaps looking at space. Interestingly, it says that the space domain must become, I think it says, one of the primary focuses of the National Armaments Director. So, that's quite a strong plug for where the UK might offer the most advantage, both to the NATO alliance, particularly if America is diverted elsewhere, but also to the UK space industry. So there's some strong hooks in there, but it's not a golden dome pitch. It's a much more nuanced, much more integrated approach that I think we're going to see sort of layers upon layers. We're not going to see a big bang.
No, and I was a bit concerned because it's one thing saying, F-35 and GCAP and greater numbers, they're part of the system. That's great. But if you look at recent operational experience, that's good for shooting down cruise missiles. It's no good at ballistic missiles. That's not a defense. And bluntly, you go, okay, so we currently have no umbrella. There is no lid on the can. We can sense when things are coming our way, but we can't do anything about it. And that feels like a critical vulnerability. I know there's no easy answer to it. And they made a nod to it, but the funds involved were nothing more than notional. It wasn't going to fund a proper defence there.
Yeah, it's hard to know if this is because defence has realised it can't afford to do this alone, that it's going to leave this to the broader security strategy and therefore national resilience, and whether that then comes up with the conclusion that we've got some vulnerable points, how the hell are we going to protect them? Interesting, in the air sector, it does talk about some of our vulnerabilities. It singles out Bryce Norton as clearly a point of weakness because there's so many things in one place, and then talks very specifically about agile combat employment, dispersal, use of commercial airfields, or even use of extra commercial support. So, yeah, it's kind of dealing with the problem in a different way than shooting things out of the sky. There's a bit more work to be done on this one, I think. But we know that we can't solve this with a magic dome. That's just not. It's not in the budget.
And the other one that caught my eye was that you and I did our flying training 1,000 years ago when Pontius was a pilot, but on the Hawk T1. And the Hawk T1 is still operating today. The Hawk T2 was brought in. We haven't got time to go through the background of it. Meant to be fully upgraded, but it's never really delivered on that promise, sort of foisted upon the military by politicians. What was mentioned in this review, though, was getting rid of T1 and T2 and replacing it with a more cost-effective model and looking to potentially exporting training. I thought that was really interesting, given that you'd expect a defence review to be focused on the big ticket items. That one was a relatively small one, but clearly justified mentioning in the review.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see what gets mentioned by name, because you kind of think, okay, well, those not promises, but they're clearly very strong nods. And you and I have just gone through almost all of those. So anything not mentioned, you could argue hasn't got any money allocated to it. So that's a separate issue. But yeah, we know the T1 is old in the tooth, and we know it's linked to the sort of totemic idea of replacing the red arrows. Put that to one side, which, by the way, doesn't get a mention in the defence review. So I don't know what that means. But T2, we know there are problems with the T2, and we don't have enough, and they're just not working as we hoped they would. So there does need to be a replacement. I think this is one of those areas which is going to be fascinating. Do we go and build our own product? And we know there are some UK options out there, but that would mean starting from scratch, albeit with potential export. Or do we go buy something off the shelf, either as a platform or even as a training product? So I think all bets are on, but it was quite specific, wasn't it, about a replacement? So I think that is as strong. And we've heard the chief say it previously, even in front of Parliament. So perhaps it wasn't a surprise, but being singled out like that, it's clearly high up on the priority list.
And the final area was space. I think I've always been intrigued by the space bit. You know, space is an order of magnitude more expense. You know, it is becoming increasingly a congested, contested environment. You know, it's phenomenally expensive. There are the big players, China, Russia, America, are all vying for influence there, and we're becoming increasingly dependent on it. I think it was interesting that it was raised as a profile, but of course you're not going to put a great deal of money against it, but it was demonstrating the defence review. We've got to work more closely with allies, and I know it wasn't mentioned in there, but there is this sense that since Brexit we've moved away from some of the European initiatives in space, and I wonder whether that's a signpost that we may need to get closer in bed with our European colleagues to generate a more robust and credible space strategy.
Yeah, I did a quick totting up, actually, because there are the 62 recommendations, which I understand the government have accepted in full. So it's not like this is now up for debate. This is now the blueprint for which everything else now flows. The Army and the Navy had 5 recommendations each. Air had 3 recommendations, and Space had the shortest chapter and only 2 recommendations. But if you just went on numbers of recommendations alone, I think for me, my lesson was, actually, that means that Air and Space isn't too badly placed. In other words, there weren't major changes required. But when you read the recommendations, they were quite crunchy. And on the space, you know, it really is about resilience in space. It is going to be contested, and we are going to need to put more and more onus on things like space communications and space surveillance. If we want to do integrated air and missile defense more effectively, you need to find a way of spotting what's coming at you, and the best place to do that from is space, if it's possible to do it. And if you're going to be an integrated force, it needs to talk to each other, and the best way of doing that is through space. So although space didn't get a lot of words, it's woven into everything. And therefore, those 2 recommendations alone should be manna from heaven for the space industry. And I think what we're going to see is some quite significant investment come into that area. And I do think as well, the UK eyes that as an area that it really can show an advantage and a leadership role within NATO. So, it's all up arrows there, which is a good thing.
As a sort of resume then, I mean, I think it was a positive review. Let's discount a couple of things. First of all, there's been recent announcements around long-range missiles, 7,000, stuff like that. My own take is that a lot of that is actually in response to Ukraine, that you and I have been attending briefings the last 3 years saying we're investing in our defence industrial base, we're going to start spinning up and investing because we need to match Russia's pace of generating these shells and missiles. The reality is we haven't done that, and I think it feels like a little bit late in the day, but that's more of a covering off Ukraine. In terms of the the rest of the SDR. Clearly questions about money, because funding without vision without funding is hallucination. And therefore, what was your overall take? A positive thing, a bit ambitious, no money, or hope for the future?
I think because and I know you have, been bitten by reviews in the past, I can't help but see the positive in this one, because it's not as bad as all the others have been, either in getting it wrong or just making a complete mismatch between where we were and where we thought we could be. But we mustn't sit and look at this through rose-tinted spectacles. This is incredibly difficult to deliver. We're in a bad place. Defence has got itself into a space that is not ideal, and is not how you design it today if you knew where you should have been. The promise of more money is great, because it's better than the promise of no more money, but it's not in your hand. And it's not now. And so a lot of this money is later in the program. So for Defence have got a really difficult job to do. They've got to plan for what they think they're going to get and make that shift into this new digital space, albeit relatively cheaply. I think, therefore, that and perhaps that's why there's an absence of a lot of heavy metal in the paper. The promises it makes, promises if they are promises, i.e. the up arrows are quite modest. In air, we've seen more combat air, some more E7s and a Hawk replacement and some A400s. So there's a little bit of hardware in there, but it's not big numbers. And in fact, it doesn't even promise numbers. So it's left itself a lot of room for wriggling, and some of that might have to come later. I think the transformation and reform program, which has to happen quickly, we cannot have another 5-year damp squib. And the National Armaments Director, the new strategic headquarters, has got to start firing very, very early on. So that's the hard bit. Industry's got to step up, but Defence has got to step up too with government to help industry do that. The money then will start to trickle, and I think trickle's not an unfair description. And then by the time the taps are turned on, because the whole thing has worked, then we can all sit here and say, yeah, that was a great job, well done. But boy, oh boy, the hard yards are to come. The writing of it is the easy bit. The delivery is the trick.
I think my takeaway, which I'm quite surprised is my takeaway, in the past I've always focused on the military capability angle of it and lamented the lack of shopping list. I honestly believe now that the world feels like a more dangerous place. Globally, more people are going to be spending money. Russian exports have been proven to be not very capable, so there's going to be more people in the market for Western military kit. And therefore, we have a great opportunity in this country to actually not only be the vanguard of that, but also vanguard of exporting. And if we can somehow work together with industry so that they're successful with export, that will make the whole thing much more affordable for our country, as long as we have the right economic model so that every pound we spend in defence, we get some credit for that export. I think that could be a really, really positive view. But my goodness, we've had collectively between you and I 7 decades of experience of people talking about this and never delivering it. There is an opportunity there.
Well, you're so right. There is a weakness in using percentages of GDP as a measure of what you should spend on defence. But of course, there is another beauty that 3% of GDP is a lot more money if your GDP is a lot bigger. So if this genuinely comes off and this genuinely becomes an engine for growth, then your GDP goes up, so you get more for your 3%. So yeah, that's a win-win. I think on balance, this is positive. The naysayers will say it's too little too late. And I understand why they're saying that. And defence can't spend their way out of this. It's got to think its way out of it, and it's got to do things differently. To be fair, the review makes that crystal clear. But somebody said this the other day when we did the Levine report, and it changed the way it took us 4 years. 4 years to even get to the new model, and then the new model never really worked, and we're now about to reverse that model. So we've done this before and failed. So yeah, we should not sit here thinking, okay, it's written, it's done. No, hard work starts now.
Wise words.